Flannery O'Connor was born in 1925. She lived until 1964, and she is one of America's premier novelists. More than that, she is one of the greatest Christian writers to have lived in the 20th century. We're looking today at her work, Mystery and Manners, which was collected and edited by Robert Fitzgerald after Flannery's death. It's a collection of her talks that she gave when she traveled around the country. She was invited to speak a lot of places, Notre Dame, several different colleges, because she, of course, was a premier novelist. And many people wanted to know, okay, you're a great storyteller. How do you write what you write? How should we read your writing? Can you share with us what it means to be a literary author in this current culture? What does it mean with your relationship with the Catholic Church and your fiction? How should Christians approach fiction? And so Flannery goes about trying to answer these questions. You will find that some things in Mystery and Manners are repeated because each of these essays were not meant to stand alone. In fact, she would give a talk and then she would rewrite or rehearse some of the same points that she had made in earlier talks, revise them to give at other lectures and other places. But a lot of the same themes will come up over and over again. One of the first essays that we want to look at is Nature and Aim of Fiction. What is the nature and the aim of fiction itself? Well, for Flannery, the heart of fiction was to tell the truth. Now, what does she mean by this? Because it's fiction. So it seems like a paradox that you write a fictional story in order to tell the truth. But what she meant by that was you have to take not only credibility in your story, but you have to be able to see the truth that is at work in reality. You cannot pretend that reality is other than it is. In other words, you can't write a character who would never feel guilty for something that he did wrong, perhaps, unless he was a psychopath, and then you would have to show that he was a psychopath. But you would have to show that the way that trees grow is the way they always grow, the way that human beings act, whether they're in love or whether they are committing sin. These are the ways that characters actually act, and this is the natural law that's in the universe is the one that it is, and you can't prescribe a new one. So the nature of people to remember, to forgive, to hurt one another, to be who they are, you have to tell that truth. And you have to make sure to tell it by describing the concrete reality around you. If you had ideas about the world, you don't put those ideas just into the mouths of characters, little bobbing heads or robots, and have them walk around professing ideas. That what makes something fiction is not only that you're addressing human nature, but that you're seeing it within humans' bodies, their fleshliness, that, like I mentioned, trees and grass and the way the sun is. And in Flannery, you'll see a lot of color, the red road, right? Because she lived in Georgia. And so you have all these red clay roads. And so she always wants you to start with nature as it is perceived and not the ideas or grappling with sin or love apart from that natural world. For Flannery, this kind of way of seeing the world was not only to see it in its particular concreteness, but also to see what was beyond it. So for Flannery, you don't have an abstract notion of Jesus Christ just being presented ethereally in her fiction, nor do you only have a symbol of him. So the sun symbolizes Jesus Christ in her stories. Rather, the sun will act in such a way, for example, in a temple of the Holy Ghost, in which it is the host as well. There's a more enchanted vision of reality in which the thing both is that and points beyond itself. So it is the sun rising in the sky, but it also points to the host being lifted up in adoration. And so you have this connection between the physical and the literal reality and then the spiritual sense of the thing. She, of course, is reading a lot of the patristic writers that would have seen this in scripture, and she wants to move her readers to the point where through her fiction, they can see this in reality and of course also become hopefully better readers of the Bible and be able to see it in the Bible as well. She wants readers not just to read the work for themselves, but for that vision that they would gain that points beyond their own eyes, that takes them beyond their own vision of the world to a higher way of seeing the world, to a place where they don't just see nature, but they see grace. She writes a couple of essays that I really love that are often overlooked. One of them is Teaching Literature, and the other one is The Total Effect in the 8th grade. And I love these as a teacher, as someone who's taught junior high and elementary school and high school, because too many teachers of literature completely ruin literature for students. They do things like one of Flannery O'Connor's most famous stories is called A Good Man is Hard to Find, and the misfit in it is wearing a hat, and she goes to a school one time and someone says, what's the point? What does the hat symbolize? And she said, it covers his head. Like, he's wearing a hat because it covers his head. It doesn't have to symbolize anything. Like, start with the story. And for Flannery, she's never saying don't analyze. In the same way that C.S. Lewis shows us that the imagination is that first point of entry, and then the intellect, and then the will, right? Imagining the human person in these 3 concentric circles. For Flannery, the experience of a story is first and foremost. It's an imaginative activity. Secondarily, the work of a critic would be then to use the intellect to break down what you see in the story, to think about it more deeply, to apply the figures and what they mean, to ask those kind of reasonable questions about the story and what it's doing. But first, experience the mystery. First, experience what the story is doing. And its colors, its smells, its world that you enter into, the emotions, hopefully, that you feel when a character dies, or a character does something stupid or cringeworthy, or you love something, or you feel inspired by a character's action. First, experience it before you start breaking it apart. Oftentimes, if you break it into too many different pieces, you'll miss what the story actually is and what the story is doing. And second, she wants to point out to characters, to students who are dealing with literature, that you can't just come to the story as though you know how to read it without recognizing that every story is within a tradition of stories. And the way she talks about this is, the discipline of literature. There are certain works, let's take T.S. Eliot, for example. To read the 4 quartets, you might have this beautiful imaginative experience. But if you try to break the 4 quartets apart without recognizing that it comes within a tradition of Hopkins and Julian of Norwich and George Herbert and all of the writers that have come before him, and that he is responding to and in conversation with, you're not going to be able to understand the work. We might think of this as the patristics trying to understand one verse of the Bible within the totality of the Bible, right? From Genesis to Revelation, we have this redemptive spirit in which God is limiting our sinful approach to reality and trying to free us towards his way of being in the world that we are so far astray from, right? And you see this total effect of the Bible, right? As the collected works of God, as we've mentioned. And Flannery wants us to see each story as what is its total effect within the tradition of literature, within the work of that writer, within the conversation of that writer's influences and that writer's faith, and that and she does say at some point that you shouldn't consider the authorial intention, and I'll go into that in a minute because it's not exactly what she means. So I want to break that out a little bit, but to see the whole effect of the piece, and if at the end the whole effect of the piece is that the 8th grader doesn't like it, you should not care. I think it's way too common nowadays that teachers ask students, like, what did you think? Did you like it? And that's not the point. They do not have their preference, their taste. It's kind of like, I think I've mentioned this before even, it's kind of like asking a 3-year-old if she likes Indian food when she's an American country girl and she's only really had a taste for chicken nuggets and macaroni and cheese. Well, she doesn't get to judge, curry because she doesn't have the taste for it. She doesn't know how good it can be. And we have to really develop the taste of students and develop the taste of children so that they can properly enjoy the goods before them. In Flannery's time, I think even as it is now in the 21st century, we have questions between what this looks like for Christians and the rest of the world. And she was always pushing back on this idea that Christians had to have a didactic message, that from the secular perspective, the church was going to destroy somebody's art because you don't have freedom when you have this totalizing narrative of who you are, and you only get to define human beings in a certain way, and you only get to define the world in a certain way, and God is putting all these parameters on you. And instead, Flannery is saying, actually, I have way more freedom than I would have if I was not a Christian, because I'm able to see things that most people can't see, and that's the truth. I'm able to see the world as it truly is and not as I want it to be. I'm not out there searching and trying to figure out the story that I need to tell, the story that I'm a part of, the story of the world, the history of the world. She knows those things because she's been taught them by the church, and that has given her the freedom to tell a good story and to tell it truthfully. She understands both evil and darkness, but also in light of goodness and beauty. And she thinks anybody who doesn't have that total vision is going to end up telling one side of the story. They're going to tell things slanted. They're going to either say that the world is all dark and nihilistic and evil, or they're going to be a sentimentalist, which deprives us of the grit and the darkness of reality and only sees the good things and has the rose-colored glasses, and instead doesn't get to the heart of the truth, which always includes Good Friday and then resurrection. Novelist and believer. So this essay is one of those essays that I studied over and over again when I was trying to be a writer, because I wanted to see the world the way Flannery did. I wanted to understand what it meant to be like Flannery, in which I believed the world was the way it was, that God created us good, then we were fallen, and we are capable of redemption, and we're moving towards restoration. And I feel like Flannery knew how to do that. And so I studied this essay. You should see my notes on Novelist and Believer from when I was a student. And I just wrote all over this thing. I was really trying to understand everything that she meant and taking notes. And I was thrown by her, I wrote like unabashed, that she just believed that writing could be this stumbling block and that could be a good thing. And I loved her honest perception of the world. I loved her desire to scandalize towards truth rather than to hide the truth or to disguise it. Instead, she was constantly wanting to hold up an accurate mirror to the reader. And the final line in this essay says that the novelist may only end in showing us the face of the devil that possesses us, but maybe that's what we need right now, is to see ourselves that way. And so I've added this picture of Flannery that was a self-portrait, in which a lot of people have said that it looks like an icon. It looks a lot like the Pantocrator. And here, I think she's giving us her understanding of art being iconic, art reading the reader, and kind of the divine gaze showing the reader that its eyes are not the full picture, but it needs the divine gaze upon it to see itself accurately, to be able to exercise any of the darkness that is there or any of that impartiality that's there. O'Connor often writes about the freak, and she said that the artist of today writes about the freak because he is still able to recognize one. Most of us actually are freaks. If you imagine that we are goods that are under construction, to use her language, we are in the process of being these creatures who were perfectly formed and then fallen and now redeemed. So it's this movement. If you tried to be, we talk about the transformational power of literature, anything that's going to be reformed is going to look strange in the process, right? When the metal is melting and moving into a mold, and or if you take a piece of wood and you whittle it into a different shape, it's going to be this painful process, which we are in the middle of, and so we're going to kind of look half-formed. One of the things that Flannery talks about quite a bit is being able to see with the prophetic eyes, right? The eyes of the freak as well. So not just seeing the freak in ourselves and seeing the freak in nature, but having the freak gaze on things, if I can put it that way, the outsider's perspective, the prophet's perspective. And so you imagine the prophets of Israel, so someone like Ezekiel. And here you have someone who is not just swept away by the currents of the time, but is actually able to stand apart and see what's wrong and see things within God's covenant and God's history. And also because he's looking backwards in this sense, and because he's listening to a higher vision than the current moment, he can see things more fully and then reflect, not intentionally, but because of God's Spirit, reflect things that are far away and the way that they might happen. In that sense, the writer is writing for eternity. The writer is writing for an audience that doesn't yet exist. And to be able to do that, your work is going to seem freakish. You're going to seem freakish because you're not just swimming with the culture. You're not going to just fit in, and you will end up standing apart. And we have to be readers who stand apart as much as the writers who stand apart. We have to be willing to not be so swept away with our current moment that we can't recognize the truth, because it may sound so different from the headlines. It may sound different than all the stories we see in social media, because it's responding to something that is true, that has always been true, and that will always be true. And therefore, especially if the world is telling us lies right now, the truth might sound freakish. But hopefully, at least in Flannery's words, it always sounds prophetic. Finally, Flannery was a Catholic in the Protestant South, and therefore her work, of course, is somewhat freakish. She is the minority perspective in her culture at that particular time. She does not have she is not surrounded by people like her in that sense. And she was also someone who was suffering from her disability with lupus, and that she often, did not like reporters talking about. She said, does my lupus affect the way that I write? No, because I use my head and not my feet to write with, so she was always pushing against that interpretation of her stories. And yet at the same time, she was recognizing that as a Catholic, as someone who's in the South, as someone with these particular distinguishing qualities about who she is, she can only write the way that she is. She can only tell the story from who she is. And she recognized her limitations as being fruitful for the kind of story she was going to tell. She often pointed out that moving home from the North made her fiction better, being back in this particular time and place, this home that she could dig into, that she could look underneath the surface of, and that she could situate herself in that way and not lose sight of who she was and the kind of stories that she was meant to tell. She also, as a Catholic, recognized the bounds of tradition, the perspective of Scripture, these things that were going to enhance her vision. And she saw herself as participating in this community of those who were like her in that sense. So even though in her particular culture, she did not have the church around her, she knew she had the church at large around her. And she was always writing with that idea, with that mentality of, I am a Catholic writer. And she didn't disdain that the way some writers, Green or Waugh, didn't want the label, or Walker Percy didn't want the label because it felt like the label was reductive. Instead, Flannery very much embraced the label because she found it so freeing, that this Catholic sense meant that she was responding to something much higher than the limits of her current time and place. And that is all about Flannery. I feel like I could talk about Flannery forever, but I hope that this was helpful in trying to understand the way that Flannery read fiction, and also the way, of course, that she wrote it. And we will try to get a handle on that as we unpack some of her stories.